modern economic growth, what are its basic features? So Debraj Ray started by telling this that Simon Kuznets in his book, he talks about modern economic growth, and he says this that if you look at most of the economies today, in case if they achieve 3% growth rate, we say, okay, fine, we approve that you are going on or you are growing, right? But we won't be looking at that with a surprise, right? Oh wow, कितनी देखो कितनी अच्छी ग्रोथ है, 3% ग्रोथ पे ग्रो कर रही है इकोनॉमी. We don't look at it that way. But that is not the case for most part of the modern history, right? So he says this that 3% annual growth rates, 3% annual growth rates, we approve them. All right. Not surprised. These are not complete sentences. So you will have to write complete sentences, right? You're not surprised by them. He says this, you look at the entire modern history, you'll find this, that growth, I mean, in case the country is growing, that is an exception, that is not a rule. Right now, we as a rule ask that at what rate countries are growing, right? So that is not the case, right? So what do we have? Throughout. Throughout modern history, growth rates were an exception. Were an exception. And not a rule. ऐसा नहीं है कि that growth rates were a rule कि हर country को grow करना ही है. Nothing like that. So it was not that every country has to grow. It was an exception कि शायद कोई country grow कर जाती होगी. Right. So अगर आप देखें, you look at Netherlands, then he started giving examples. From the period of 1520, I guess, 1580 to 1820. Right? It was a leading industrial nation of that time. And its growth rate in labor productivity, its growth rate in real GDP per worker, real growth rate in real GDP per worker hour is given by 0.2%. इतने साल में बस इतना ही. And that was a leading industrial nation. You look at England. Right. You look at England. England में देखें, then from period of 1820 to 19 or to 1890, its annual growth rate was 1.2%. Right? Annual growth rate was 1.2%. आप आज के किसी इकोनॉमी को देखेंगे तो देखेंगे कि बताओ, ये तो लीडिंग इंडस्ट्रियल नेशन था, ये भी सिर्फ 1.2% पे ग्रो कर रहा था. अब तो हम अगर इंडिया की ग्रोथ रेट 6% या 7% होती तो भी हम कहते हैं ठीक ही ग्रो कर रही है, बिकॉज वी आर अकस्टम्ड एंड वी वांट इकोनॉमीज टू ग्रो एट 10% और सो, राइट? Then you look at United States. From the period of 1890 to present, its annual growth rate averaged with 2% per annum. और अगर आप उसमें भी 1990 से 2011 का ले लें डेटा, तो वो कुछ 1.7% से ग्रो करी है. और ये बड़ी इकोनॉमीज हैं. these were big economies. Netherlands, England, USA. These are the nations we look up to. These are developed nations. And they also have not grown much, right, as compared to the modern standards, if you look at it. So you look at, in very recent past, you look at the growth rates of Japan, you look at the growth rate of East Asia, and now you look at the growth rates of South Asia, you will find this that they were hardly growing, but they're still leading industrial economies, right? So एक लाइन लिखेंगे. That is impressive. But it is not still what we have seen lately. What we have seen lately. First Japan, then East Asia, then South Asia, right? Then Debraj Ray, he started and he told about, if you look at most of the developed nations, right? For example, Netherlands or Western Europe or US, right? Then most of these countries were able to grow in 19th and the 20th century. And they have taken off their economies. So, for example, you might have seen Rostow's 5 stages of growth. So they have taken off their economy. But if you look at developing countries, their growth story has not even started for most of them, they have not started even by the end of Second World War, because that was the time when the colonialism mostly has ended. So in the 19th and 20th century, in the 19th and 20th century, only a handful of countries, mostly in Europe, right, North America, and यहाँ पे भी you can be specific, Western Europe, North America, could manage to take off into sustained growth. ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए था कोई स्पाइक हो, बस एक साल किसी दिन ग्रो कर गया उसके बाद नहीं. Should be sustained growth. और आप यूरोप की इकोनॉमीज को देख लीजिए, you might see US economy, they were sustaining themselves throughout this time period, albeit at the low level, but the growth might be at the low level, but its repercussion even at growing at this low level is too much, right? And if you look at developing countries, right, third world countries, or third world countries, growth story has only begun by the end of World War II. By the end of World War II, when colonialism ended. Out today somewhere, and I don't have a proper table uh, where I'm so accustomed in writing, so my handwriting is bad. I'm so sorry about it. Colonialism, when colonialism ended, right? So their story has begun very late. So you just think about it. The country who has started growing for last 200 years, 2% it is growing. And the country who has just started growing, maybe just 50 years back. So there is a lot of catching up which is involved. बहुत सारा catching up is still involved. So there are a few things which are noted by this analysis. This is true that most of these developing economies, maybe East Asian economies, even our economy, we might be growing at a very high level as compared to the growth rate which are experienced by developed nations today. Most of these developed nations are growing at 1.5%, 2% or so, but we might be growing at 7%, 7.5%. But you have to understand there is still a lot of catching up which you have to do. Please write. Despite the very high growth rates, of developing countries, right? There is plenty of catching up to do, right? Now you have to understand few other things. One, if you look at the other developed nations which have developed earlier developed nations, at that time only they were developing. They were not having much competition from the entire world, right? So they were uninhabited. This environment was uninhabited. The word used is uninhabited by nations of far greater growth, right? Or far greater economic strength. Just see the level of analysis which he has done. Now developed nations, not new, now developed nations. What are now developed nations? There might be few middle income countries which are growing so fast that they can also become developed countries. What we're talking about now, developed nation. Let's say, for our purposes, Western Europe and US. When they were growing, they didn't have much competition from the other countries of the similar economic strength. Now developed nations grew in an environment uninhabited by nations of far greater economic strength, right? Uh, but if you look at today's developing nations, you will find this. You will find this that these nations, these today's developing nations, for example, India, China, other countries which are developing fast, they not only have to have a very high growth rates, their growth rates they have to exceed the historical experience also. You can't say, no, England was also growing at 2%. Even if I'm growing at 2%, that's enough. No, it is not enough in today's world, right? Today, the story is completely different, right? Um, the developing nations, the developing nations not only need to grow, but grow at rates faster than historical experience. Faster than historical experience, right? The another point which he has said is this developing economies is developing or development economics is very theoretical. So you will have to write a lot. I can't help it. But you have to understand that the developing countries are now sitting in a different kind of world. Developed nations have too much of economic strength, one, right? And secondly, the developing nations should also grow at very fast rate. Why? Because there is a very quick uh, flow of information, right? So please write this. Developing nations developing nations are surrounded by. Very powerful, very economically powerful, developed nations. Economically powerful, developed nations, right? And they have to grow in an environment they have to grow in an environment which is characterized by free flow of information. Now you will say, how does that make a difference? You will say, how does that make a difference? Right. So this makes a difference. This makes a difference. Why? Because people are not people now aware about the different kind of products which exist in different parts of the world. Their aspirations, they also grow, right? They are they now perceive this, that my country is not able to provide, but their country is able to provide goods and services. So developing nations, in order to achieve or in order to satisfy those human aspirations also, in this very complex world, they also have to grow at very, very high rates. So these are few basic points about the modern economic growth, right? And the way Debraj Ray has discussed this. So I'll take the discussion further, and tomorrow I'll step into Harrod Dormer model, right? So I hope this was useful to you. Thank you, Beta.